Hospital staff had no idea that entering the unconscious homeless man's information into the system would trigger a presidential visit within hours. For 3 days, this bloodied stranger with no family or friends had been just another patient in intensive care, someone whose brutal beating on Main Street required medical attention but generated no visitors, no flowers, and no concern from anyone who might have cared about his recovery. The routine identity registration seemed like standard procedure for unconscious patients without identification documents. But what the hospital staff couldn't have known was that typing John Mitchell's name into their database would activate automated systems designed to protect America's most classified military secrets and trigger a chain of events that would transform their quiet medical facility into the center of a security operation that would soon capture the attention of the most powerful person in the world. The phone call that changed everything came at exactly 2:47 p.m. on John's third day in intensive care, when hospital administrator Margaret Stevens answered a call that would make her question everything she thought she knew about the homeless man in room 314. The voice identified himself as Colonel James Harrison from the Pentagon, speaking with an authority that civilian institutions rarely encountered. When the colonel calmly informed Stevens that President Trump would be visiting their hospital within 48 hours to see the unconscious vagrant everyone assumed was just another street victim, her first reaction was to assume someone was playing an elaborate prank. But what Administrator Stevens couldn't have anticipated was that John Mitchell's fingerprints had already triggered security protocols that were about to reveal why the most powerful man in America needed to personally visit someone the hospital had been treating as a nameless nobody. Within hours of that phone call, City General Hospital underwent a transformation that left staff members questioning whether they were still working at the same medical facility they had known for years. Secret Service agents arrived to conduct security assessments that turned routine patient care into something resembling a classified military operation. Federal communications specialists installed equipment that most hospital employees had never seen before, while security checkpoints appeared at entrances that had been freely accessible just hours earlier. Dr. Sarah Rodriguez found herself briefing federal agents about John's medical condition as if his recovery involved matters of national security rather than standard trauma treatment. But what none of the medical staff could have understood was that the broken man in room 314 possessed secrets that required protection at the highest levels of American government. And his current circumstances represented failures that would soon demand answers from officials whose careers depended on ensuring that certain truths never became public knowledge. The media attention began building as news outlets struggled to understand why President Trump was making an unscheduled visit to see an unidentified homeless veteran whose background remained classified for reasons that no one would explain. Television trucks arrived to establish positions for coverage of an event that represented the kind of human interest story that political reporters rarely encountered during routine White House press briefings. Journalists questioned hospital staff about the patient who warranted presidential attention, but received only vague responses about privacy regulations and security requirements that prevented detailed discussion. What the media couldn't have known was that their speculation about routine veteran recognition was about to be overwhelmed by revelations that would prove this case involved circumstances far more extraordinary than anyone reporting the story could have imagined. The attack that brought John Mitchell to this moment of presidential attention had seemed like random street violence when three men cornered him behind a downtown dumpster where desperation had driven him to search for recyclable materials. The beating lasted 12 minutes, during which his attackers used fists, boots, and a metal pipe to inflict injuries that left him unconscious in a pool of blood for nearly 4 hours before discovery. What appeared to be routine urban violence against a vulnerable homeless individual generated no attention beyond emergency responders and hospital staff who treated similar cases regularly. But what those attackers couldn't have known was that the man they had chosen to brutalize possessed training that had made him one of the most lethal operatives in American military history. and their random act of cruelty was about to trigger events that would expose secrets protected at the highest levels of government classification. Emergency responders who found John's condition initially questioned whether transport to the hospital would serve any meaningful purpose, given injuries that included multiple fractured ribs, severe head trauma, and internal bleeding that suggested life-threatening organ damage. His face was so swollen and distorted that identification seemed impossible, while vital signs remained weak and inconsistent throughout the ambulance ride to City General. Paramedics noted extensive scarring across his torso and arms that clearly predated his current injuries by years, wounds that displayed patterns inconsistent with civilian accidents or typical street violence. But what the emergency medical team couldn't have recognized was that John Mitchell's scars told a story of battles fought in places that didn't exist on official maps, and his survival of the current attack was possible only because his body had been conditioned through experiences that most Americans would never know had occurred to protect their freedom. The revelation that would explain everything began with routine fingerprint identification procedures used for unconscious patients without conventional documentation. When John's prints were processed through standard databases, the response was immediate and unprecedented, triggering notifications to officials responsible for monitoring veterans whose service included operations so classified that their welfare required ongoing attention from agencies with appropriate security clearances. Hospital staff watched as their facility filled with federal personnel whose presence suggested that routine patient care had become something far more significant than anyone had anticipated. But what civilian medical workers couldn't have understood was that John Mitchell's military service had included missions that prevented terrorist attacks, rescued American hostages, and eliminated threats that would have killed thousands of innocent people if his operations had failed or been discovered by enemy forces. The story behind John's current circumstances began with a phone call that destroyed everything he had spent 15 years of military service protecting, delivered while he was deployed in Syria conducting operations that would never appear in official reports. His commanding officer's voice carried the professional detachment that military personnel learned when delivering news that would fundamentally alter someone's understanding of their world. The break-in at John's family home had occurred during broad daylight, when his wife Rebecca was helping their 2 children with homework at the kitchen table where they gathered every afternoon. What started as a routine burglary by a drug-addicted intruder escalated into violence that claimed 3 innocent lives, for reasons that would never make sense to anyone who understood the kind of people Rebecca and their children had been. But what John couldn't have known during that devastating phone call was that losing his family would trigger psychological trauma that would eventually lead him to the streets, where a random beating would accidentally expose secrets that had been hidden for over a decade. The intruder who entered through Rebecca's unlocked back door was motivated by addiction rather than malicious intent, seeking valuable items to support a habit that had already destroyed his own family relationships and employment prospects. Their neighborhood represented the kind of community where families felt secure and children played outside without supervision, where unlocked doors reflected trust in community safety rather than carelessness about personal security. When Rebecca discovered the stranger searching their living room, his panic at being witnessed transformed simple theft into a cascade of violence that killed John's entire family to avoid identification that proper legal representation might have addressed through plea negotiations. But what the intruder couldn't have known was that his random choice of targets would eventually trigger a presidential visit that would expose how America's most classified military operations had failed to protect the families of the operatives who conducted them. John's return from deployment to attend 3 funerals instead of the family reunion he had anticipated created trauma that military psychological support systems weren't designed to address effectively. The counseling services available through Veterans Affairs provided frameworks for processing combat stress, but offered inadequate guidance for addressing the complete destruction of everything that had motivated 15 years of dangerous service and personal sacrifice. His grief became complicated by guilt over his absence when his family needed protection, and by rage towards circumstances that demanded his service overseas while failing to ensure basic security for those whose safety justified every risk he accepted. But what John couldn't have anticipated was that his inability to process these emotions through conventional therapy would lead to behavioral changes that would eventually cost him his housing, his benefits, and ultimately his identity as anything other than another forgotten homeless veteran. The progression from military service to life on the streets occurred gradually as John's psychological condition made employment and social relationships increasingly difficult to maintain despite access to veteran benefits and support services. His attempts to establish new routines outside military structure were constantly undermined by memories that triggered defensive responses inappropriate for civilian situations, and by survivor's guilt that made personal happiness seem like betrayal of family members who would never pursue their own dreams. As friends and extended family struggled to understand grief, complicated by military experiences they couldn't relate to, John's isolation increased through misunderstandings and defensive behaviors that pushed away people who wanted to help. But what those trying to assist John couldn't have understood was that his military service had included operations so classified that he couldn't discuss the experiences that had shaped his psychological responses, making effective therapy impossible and ensuring that his trauma would remain untreated until circumstances forced it into the open. The final descent into homelessness accelerated when bureaucratic complications interrupted John's veteran benefits during a period when his mental state made self-advocacy nearly impossible. Landlords who initially showed patience eventually required reliable rent payments that John couldn't provide when trauma responses made workplace relationships unsustainable. His pride and military training made accepting charity feel like personal failure, while his psychological condition made trusting new people and institutions increasingly difficult as his support network continued to shrink. Resources available through veteran service organizations required navigation of bureaucratic processes that his mental state made challenging, while growing mistrust prevented him from accessing assistance that might have interrupted his downward spiral. But what social workers and veteran advocates couldn't have known was that John Mitchell's background included classified service that made him ineligible for many conventional support programs, and that his true identity was protected by security protocols that would prevent anyone from understanding why standard interventions had failed until circumstances forced the truth into the open. President Trump's visit to City General Hospital occurred exactly 72 hours after John's identity had been confirmed through Pentagon databases, demonstrating the efficiency that presidential attention could provide when individual cases represented broader policy failures that demanded immediate address. The president's motorcade arrived with security arrangements that temporarily transformed the hospital into a facility operating under military-level protection protocols, while media coverage focused on the symbolic importance of presidential recognition for veteran homelessness, without understanding the true significance of the visit. President Trump's entourage included Secretary of Defense James Mattis and Veterans Affairs Secretary Robert Wilkie, officials whose presence indicated that John's case involved policy considerations extending beyond simple acknowledgement of individual service. But what media observers couldn't have known was that the classified briefing preceding the president's visit had revealed service records that would forever change how senior officials understood the sacrifices required by America's most dangerous military operations. The meeting between President Trump and John Mitchell lasted 45 minutes, during which the president personally acknowledged service that had prevented terrorist attacks on American soil and rescued hostages whose capture would have created international incidents requiring military responses that could have led to full-scale warfare. The president's recognition included not only verbal acknowledgement of John's heroism, but also concrete assistance designed to ensure that his housing, medical care, and financial needs would be permanently addressed through programs specifically designed for veterans whose service required ongoing support. John's final deployment had included single-handedly eliminating 8 armed guards while his team extracted 12 American hostages and secured intelligence that prevented coordinated attacks on American embassies that would have killed hundreds of civilians. But what the president couldn't have anticipated was that John's story would become a catalyst for policy changes that would transform how America cared for veterans whose classified service had protected the nation while making their own transition to civilian life nearly impossible. The comprehensive support package that President Trump announced represented the kind of coordinated response that individual veterans rarely received when bureaucratic systems failed to address complex needs effectively. John would receive immediate housing assistance through discretionary funds established for veterans whose service required special consideration, while his medical care would continue through Veterans Affairs programs designed to address both combat-related injuries and psychological trauma. Career counseling services would help identify employment opportunities that utilized his military skills while accommodating his recovery process, and security clearances would enable work in positions appropriate to his experience and expertise. But what hospital staff observing these arrangements couldn't have understood was that John's case represented acknowledgement of systemic failures that had allowed America's most decorated covert operatives to fall through support systems that were supposed to ensure their welfare after years of service that could never be publicly recognized. The transformation in John Mitchell's circumstances occurred with remarkable efficiency, as presidential attention eliminated bureaucratic obstacles that had previously seemed insurmountable to social workers and veteran service organizations who had tried to help him. Within 72 hours of President Trump's visit, John had been discharged to a furnished apartment with rent and utilities covered through programs that addressed the unique needs of veterans whose classified service complicated their eligibility for conventional benefits. His recovery accelerated significantly once basic needs were permanently secured, while psychological counseling addressed trauma that had been compounded by homelessness and constant survival stress. But what medical staff couldn't have predicted was that John's successful reintegration would become a model for addressing veteran homelessness that recognized the complex factors contributing to individual circumstances while demonstrating the potential for dramatic positive change when appropriate resources were properly coordinated. The broader implications of John Mitchell's story extended beyond individual recognition to policy discussions about veteran care and the challenges faced by military personnel whose classified service complicated their transition to civilian life without providing access to conventional recognition or support systems. President Trump's personal involvement highlighted gaps in existing support while demonstrating that comprehensive assistance could produce remarkable results when individual attention addressed problems that bureaucratic processes alone couldn't solve. John's case became symbolic of broader issues affecting military families whose service records included classified operations that prevented conventional recognition while creating unique challenges for successful civilian reintegration. But what policymakers couldn't have anticipated was that John's story would inspire legislative changes that would create new categories of veteran support, specifically designed for those whose service had been too classified to qualify for traditional recognition programs. 6 months after President Trump's visit, John Mitchell had established routines and relationships that demonstrated successful reintegration into civilian society while maintaining security requirements associated with his classified background. His apartment became a stable foundation for activities that included regular medical appointments, career training programs, and volunteer work with veteran service organizations that helped other former military personnel navigate support systems he had learned to understand through both failure and success. John's recovery illustrated that veteran homelessness could be addressed through comprehensive approaches that recognized complex contributing factors, while his story demonstrated the potential for positive change when political leadership prioritized veteran welfare over bureaucratic convenience. But what observers of John's transformation couldn't have known was that his case would establish precedents for addressing veteran care that would influence policy for decades. ensuring that future military personnel whose service required classification would receive support appropriate to their sacrifices, rather than falling through systems designed for conventional military careers. This incredible story of hidden heroism and presidential recognition demonstrates how ordinary circumstances can reveal extraordinary service that protected American lives through sacrifices that remained invisible until tragedy exposed both individual courage and systemic failures that demanded correction at the highest levels of government. If you enjoyed discovering how a homeless veteran's accidental exposure triggered presidential attention that transformed his life while revealing the true costs of America's most classified military operations, make sure to subscribe to Untold Legends Stories and hit that notification bell to never miss our daily uploads. We publish new stories every day featuring amazing tales of hidden heroes whose sacrifices protect our freedom in ways we never realize. Hit the like button if this story touched you, and leave a comment telling us what you thought about John's remarkable journey from forgotten homeless victim to presidential recognition. Let us know if you've ever wondered about the stories behind veterans you encounter in your own community, whose service may have included experiences too classified to discuss, but too important to forget. Your likes, comments, and engagement help us continue bringing you these incredible tales of people who serve our country through sacrifices that remain forever hidden until circumstances reveal their true heroism. Tomorrow we'll share another amazing story that proves heroism can be found in the most unexpected places.